So I just wanted to tell you a little bit about where I'm from, as Donna was saying, but show you a map. So I grew up right there in Holland, and this is me in traditional folk costume, which I wasn't wearing when I was 18 when this picture was taken. But that was the village where I grew up, and that village was really, really close to the town where Abel Tasman, the explorer, grew up. And he was the one who named New Zealand, because he was from the province where I grew up called Zealand. So that ultimately, I actually went from, first to Stanford and then to New Zealand was a natural progression. I told my parents, even though they didn't like I was that far away. And then after that, as Donna said, I came back again to Stanford, which was just amazing. I grew up in a small village. I never thought that I would end up in the United States, let alone in California. But I did always want to go to California because of two things. One was Led Zeppelin going to California, which I grew up on, and I was a big Zeppelin fan. And I said, well, there's such a beautiful song, I need to go there too. And the second reason was the movie The Graduate. I don't know if you know, with Dustin Hoffman. It's an old movie, but in there they have many scenes of people in convertibles driving across what I thought was the Golden Gate, and it looked so beautiful. So I want to do that. So the first time I moved to the Bay Area, I rented a convertible and I drove across the Golden Gate Bridge, playing Simon and Garfunkel from this movie. One of the things, just a little bit about my background, because it's a bit varied, and I'm also saying this because there's often a lot of people who feel that when you decide to work in computing or computer science, or you want to do a PhD, or you want to be a faculty member, you have to specialize very, very deeply and narrowly, and I'm totally the opposite, honestly. So I started studying applied mathematics with a lot of foundations also in theoretical math, so that was during my later high school years and then at university. And I got really interested in fluid mechanics. So when I did my PhD at Stanford, I got a minor in mechanical engineering, and really started applying math more and more through fluid flow simulation, because I was just intrigued by fluid flow. I love everything that flows. And that's been a bit of a theme in my career. And then I started also coastal ocean modeling. So this is a model of Monterey Bay that I worked on for a while. And when I moved to New Zealand, I did coastal ocean modeling too, because New Zealand has 14,000 kilometers of coastline, right? And so it's really interesting. And the other area where you could actually get research money in New Zealand was in yachts, in yacht design, for a particular competition called the America's Cup, which is a really big competition in yacht design. So I spent 2 campaigns working a little bit with Team New Zealand on yacht design. And when I came back to Stanford, started Stanford Yacht Research, which honestly was just me. I'm one student and $0. But we had a website and we had a name, so we were bona fide, right? Legitimate. But going back to Stanford after 5 years, they hired me in a department of what was then called petroleum engineering. And so they were looking in a broad search for somebody, a computational mathematician, who is maybe interested in reinventing herself, himself, or themselves into petroleum engineer. And to me, that was just fluid flow, but now subsurface. So I did oil and gas simulation, mostly helping mitigate harmful environmental impacts from oil and gas production, carbon sequestration, things like that for a while. And really, really interesting fluid flow problems with that too. I did something totally crazy, and I put this on there because it's the craziest thing I've ever done. I'm happy to talk to you about this movie made by National Geographic called Sky Monsters, that features me leading an engineering team building a replica of a pterosaur, a flying replica of a pterodactyl that we called Herky. And that was the most nuts project I was ever in, and I felt like a total imposter doing that. And I bring that up on purpose because feeling like an imposter is so common in academia and in our field that I want to talk about that a little bit later. But gradually over the years, of course, when you do stuff like this, you deal with a lot of data. And most of the data that I dealt with in those areas was data that I produced. So I built simulators. And when you build a simulator of a Monterey Bay in 3D, which we did, you're creating terabytes and terabytes and terabytes of data. So I entered the data science area that is now so popular, really from the data production standpoint. But over time, really got interested in other applications in data science too. And for a while, I worked with the Library of Congress, which is the biggest library in the world right here, right in the States, in DC. It's amazing. And it was one of the first libraries that started digitizing contents. I don't know if you know that, but they started digitizing already in the early 90s and late 80s. Before there was any such thing as an internet where you could dump things on and search. And so these catalogs that they have of this digital data, digitized books, digitized the Diary of Washington, it's amazing what they have. Papers, digitized papers by Van Neumann, you name it, it's all there in this library. It's incredible. And maps and pictures and movies. But these databases couldn't be searched, they couldn't be browsed, they didn't communicate with each other. So with students at Stanford, I spent about 5 years working with them, sort of building the search interfaces for their systems. And now, at the moment, actually, my final research project that I'm working on now is totally different than oil and gas production. It's decommissioning of internal combustion engine vehicles. And some of my colleagues in my department think I'm nuts because they still get sponsored by petroleum companies. But I got really interested in adoption of EVs and what that electric transport may look like and how we can faster get rid of our internal combustion engine vehicles, and to do so in a way that's equitable, because a lot of the things that are happening in California and many other states are not equitable at all. EV adoption programs, for example, subsidies are really only available to those people with a credit rating, people who can get loans. So in other words, actually the more affluent people. And so we're working with lower income communities on those projects. So totally different kind of thing, but also fun. That's the nice thing.
Is that a car going over a cliff?
This is a little model car, a little toy car, and a rock at the pond in my garden where I just thought I'd take a picture of it, pushing it over the cliff. Yeah.
Okay, so okay.
It's like the scene from Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
Yeah,
They drive it out of the.
I was thinking Thelma and Louise, but
both inspired me. Yeah.
So I was like,
yeah. Well, a little bit about the last 40 years or so, because what was been interesting for me, and I'm sure Donna and Jody and maybe some of you have seen this too, it's been incredible how things have changed, right? So I started writing everything on a typewriter still, and I had a Casio calculator. That was it. I didn't touch my first computer until my second year of university. Then I learned Pascal. I also learned Fortran 44 and 66 and then 77. And I one program on punch cards still. So that was, when I was growing up sort of in this field. And then you see some other well-known programs that MATLAB, of course, started then in the 90s, and C and C++. But the last years, there's been this proliferation of other kind of languages and tools. And I just wanted to say, I can't keep up. And this is really, really common. Most of the professors I know, my colleagues at Stanford in computer science, they don't do their own coding because they can't keep up. You have every 2 years or so, you have to change language, right? So this is a challenge that you're all facing. So what is in green is what my students program in, and what's in blue is what I stay with. But it's really interesting to see how these things constantly change and adapt, right? The other thing, of course, that has happened is that the actual computer or supercomputer flops over time, as you know, has gone up. But this is incredible to me, thinking about when I first touched what was called a supercomputer at the summer internship I did in '92 at NASA. We were here and now we're there. And it of course has changed the way that we look at computational mathematics and computer science as well. And sometimes we say that now because of this, we can get to the wrong solution so much faster than ever before, right? Because so many things have, so this is why I sometimes put this slide up. I forgot that I had this in there. But there's so many things that happen when you have this explosion of compute power. And that's one of the things I wanted to tell you a little bit about. Because the last, say, 30 years or so, if I wanted to define it, I would say it's been the 3 decades of more. So we want to increase the sizes of the programs that we're looking at. We went from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions to 4 dimensions. We went from very simple models to models with many physical processes represented in it. Think about climate change. When I first started, the climate models were really atmospheric models. And we felt really sophisticated in '94 when we coupled them to ocean models. There's a lot involved when you couple models. You have error propagation between models. You have to think about these interfaces. They can introduce all kinds of computational errors. Of course, the computational power required was much larger. But now we have like 50 to 100 different models in these climate models, including cloud formation and evaporation, and you name it. And they're all together, and it's very nonlinear. You know that term, I'm going to use that a lot, very nonlinear, and really difficult to track errors, really difficult to understand where possible errors are hiding and where they come from. And the other thing that we're doing is when we're simulating something, we want it finer and finer and finer. So when I first did my simulation of Monterey Bay, for example, our grid sizes in our simulations, so that's where we would get data for, right? When we simulate, it would be like a kilometer by a kilometer in 2D. And now we're running simulations that are 2 meters by 2 meters. So that's this grid refinement I talk about. But one of the things that happens when you're refining your grid, then the physics that you're seeing or seem to see also changes, because the behavior of your numerical method changes a lot. So in the 90s, when I saw this increase in compute speed, I honestly thought as a PhD student that I was going to be redundant, because I thought, but all these amazingly fast computers, they don't need me anymore because the models are there. We know how to model. Now with these computers, we can just put it all up and we'll get all the answers. But there were so many beautiful and at that time hidden problems that were just emerging of this sort of thing, that if you refine, you get stronger sensitivities to perturbations, which is, by the way, why the climate models they're using right now are very uncertain, right? And much more uncertain than the climate models that people presented earlier on, because the grids were larger and everything was a bit more smoothed out. And for those of you who've done numerical methods, you know about this. So we have this interplay when we're modeling between a modeling error that can go down as you're increasing the size, which we can do now because of this hardware that we have, but your compute error goes up. And for those of you who've done linear algebra, you know this because this is related to things like ill conditioning and so on. Have you heard of that term? Ill conditioning? Yeah. So you know that when your size gets bigger, your condition number gets worse, right? So you're introducing that, and at some point, you're introducing so much compute error, you cannot trust anything anymore. So in other words, when you go bigger and bigger and bigger, and by the way, in data science, it's the same. When you have more and more data, bigger and bigger hardware, that is not going to solve your problem. That's going to create more problems. So the moral of the story is, in computational sciences, you are in a field that is constantly needed, but in different ways, right? And that's so incredibly exciting for somebody working in this. And this is just an example where it said, hey, now we have these multi-physics, multi-scale models, and really difficult to analyze, very nonlinear. And there's an enormous amount of work that needs to be done still by people to understand this. And I haven't even talked about data science. So in the time that I have been studying, computer science took off. And that was, of course, because the personal computer really took off, right? So computer science became really important. While I was a grad student, computational mathematics took off. And that was following two things. One was the advance of scientific computing algorithms that were really so much better, and the hardware increase, of course. And the other one was something that I wanted to highlight because it was kind of unique. This whole idea of public domain software. So when I was a student, there were the first commercial but also shared public domain simulation codes out there. So everyone could just get something off the shelf and start simulating. And that changed the way that we did business in computational mathematics. So much so actually that a lot of people got really, really worried about this because companies got a bit burned. Boeing, for example, and here's my old friend John McMasters, who is unfortunately no longer with us. They started seeing that students, because students could also at universities just get off-the-shelf software and use programs that were already designed. So a lot of students were not interested to know what was in the software. They just wanted to be able to run it, right? They found that the people that they were hiring from universities leaned too heavily in computers and didn't understand actually what they were analyzing. Now, I put this up because I think we're in the same crisis now with data science. Okay, so that's one I want to talk about a little bit later. So McMaster's, John said, you know, we need to change this. We need to go back in engineering schools, but also in computational math and applied math department to the basics. We need to make sure that despite the fact that computational mathematics has become a household thing, people still need to understand these foundations, and we cannot just ignore that. So he actually helped rewrite engineering disciplines accreditation standards for the whole of the US. So there was a really interesting thing that happened. And also in the early 90s, and Donna, you probably remember, the simulation research community also said we're in a crisis because there were so many things that people were doing, and we call them the cowboys of simulation. They just took an off-the-shelf product, ran something, claimed victory over a problem, and published it. Now, what's happening now with data science? People take a deep learning code, they run it on some data, and they claim progress, right? So it's the same sort of thing. So what happened is that people said, hey, we need quality control. We need comparative solution projects. We need established best practices. We need to establish minimal QA and QC for publications. We talked about redesigning education and training. Companies initially jumped on this and started outsourcing because there were so many operators out there who said, we can do this for you, you know, with this software that they could just buy or get for free. But companies then got burned and they started building in-house capacity. And the same thing is happening now with data science. So really interesting historical, you know, I think, in the last 40 years. So now, of course, you know, we're in this new revolution of data science, and we see the same thing. And why is data science taking off? Because of the ubiquity of data, right? And even more affordable hardware and software and public domain software. But there is a trend here. And there's a lot of lessons we learned here in the 90s here. So I feel like grandma when they say this, right? But for me, it's like a deja vu. It's like, oh my goodness, we're going through the same problems. And this is why, right? I mean, the amount of data that we're collecting is unbelievable. And I'll let you read this, but tons of videos and emails and internet searches and you know, tweets and all that. But that's all social media. But of course, there's data collected everywhere in healthcare, in earth sciences. The year before COVID started, 400 additional satellites were put up. Now, a lot of this communication, observation, you know, surveillance. We can now observe the Earth in all kinds of ways. We can observe the surface of the Earth. We can observe the atmosphere. We can penetrate the ground for a little bit and observe using remote sensing. We can penetrate a little bit of the ocean. I mean, it's unbelievable what we can do now. And an enormous amount of money is of course associated with this. Data is penetrating all areas. When I started, I thought about my research as data supported. So I would do modeling, I would create data, and of course I would get data, observational data, to help support my work. Then at some point, maybe 20 years ago, we gathered more and more data. So data became more easily available. And I would say then we entered this area of data-inspired research. So we had a lot of data. We looked at the data, said, ooh, that's interesting. Could we model that? Right, so you looked at the data, say in Monterey Bay, and say, oh, I see some really interesting tidal motions. Can I see this also on the computer? And now we're in this area where everything is data-driven. That's different than data-inspired. Data-driven means that you only look at the data. And you're using the data and the patterns or the anomalies that you're finding in data to predict things out, try to understand things. So it's very, very different, right, now. And this is penetrating almost every area of research. That's just an LCSH little image of someone. So with this, of course, comes this thing that you know and you've seen, and it worries me to some extent, and it motivates me also for WITS, for women in data science, is this thing that decision making nowadays is data driven. So this is really important for you all to see too, because no matter what area you're interested in, no matter what area you work in, you will work with data and you will make decisions based on data. Okay, so data driven decision making. That's an unbelievably big market. And of course, then you have to say, well, who makes the decisions? Who does this sort of data-driven decision making? Who shares in the wealth? Because if you make decision, you have power. And if you have power, you're a wealth creator, right? So you see this with the big companies, of course, very, very clearly. So these questions are really important. And when you start looking at who actually shares in the wealth and helps make these decisions, you see that is not a representative slice of our society. Okay, so that's one thing that we really care about. So data has really become the new gold, the new bacon, the new oil. And yeah, but sorry.
Quick question. So one of the challenges in AI is, what is the source of the data? How good, how representative is the data actually? And, we don't have to go very far to find examples like, fatal flaws in facial recognition came about because the data that was collected was based on the people who were designing it, who did not look like the vast majority of the people on our planet.
Yeah.
So, the quality of the data, who decides which data is actually relevant? So you can analyze it to death, but if you don't have relevant data, and how do you, the ethics, and there's so many
Absolutely.
conditions towards building relevant data.
Yeah, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. Yeah, absolutely, you're so right. So important to think about this. The other thing that's happening, which we've seen a lot, is because the power in a lot of this is driven by computer science people, right? Computer science related companies as well. And so there is a tendency now of people in that field, and I'm generalizing here, and not everybody's like that, but I see this at Stanford, for example, that computer science think, all domains are really going to be subdomain of CS. Now, this is pure data-driven thinking, right? And I'm always saying, absolutely not. If you make a decision based on data, that's a community effort, right? Everybody needs to be around that table. And so you need domain experts, you need humanities and social scientists. Of course, you need mathematicians, statisticians, computer scientists, economists, business strategists, lawyers, policymakers. Everyone needs to come around the table because these are decisions we're making, even if it is just what kind of thing you see when you go to Facebook, even if it's just a decision like that, everybody needs to be involved. But one of the things that I see in the field very often, also when I'm reviewing papers, is that in the field now we're in this stage where I think there's so much hype and enthusiasm. Let's call it enthusiasm, where the data comes first and not the question that they're really trying to understand. So that's one thing I just wanted to emphasize. But guess what? That is very similar to 25 years ago when computational mathematics first started, where also these questions and whether or not what they came up with was truly useful came later. So one of the things I always tell my students is that if you're working in data science, the answer is not always a deep neural network, right? So that's another thing that you see is it's like baby Bam Bam. Do you know that from the Flintstones? Yeah, you remember. So I always, sort of feel now there's this baby Bam Bam in AI called the deep neural network, and no matter what what they want to do, they just hit it with that deep neural network, even if it's a tiny little thumbtack, right? So we need to think about this, and we need to think about data. So this is relating to what you said. Very, very often when you do data science, you need to understand where does the data come from, what's in it, what's missing, who collected the data actually, right? For what reason? How to adjust for data imperfection. Then you need to think what analyses are actually appropriate for the data. Not all of them are appropriate. What questions can the data analysis actually inform about, and what questions can they not? I've seen just very recently a consulting work that was done in the Netherlands. So let me give a funny example of my own country, where people were analyzing earthquakes induced by gas production. And they had hired this company to do AI analysis on this. And they ended up also saying something about water. and how much water would come up with this gas production. And there was nothing in the data about water. So I started asking them, so how did you come up with this water thing? And it was based on nothing, honestly, it was crazy. Anyway, so what questions they cannot is really important. Robustness, verification of results, where bias can and will creep in, who needs to be consulted and so on. So all of this needs to be looked at. And when I consult for companies, which is one thing I really like to do, particularly companies that want to move into the data science area, you see that a lot of the data science work that has been outsourced, they do not think about this. Okay. So interesting things to think about. Now, there are other pain points. There is this wonderful and very known difference between calibration and prediction that people often forget about. You hear things that people say, like, if I just have more data, then our answers will be better, which is not true, by the way. That is related to what I just talked about with computational mathematics. So if you just refine your simulation, you'll get better answers. That's also not true. There are a lot of phantom patterns and relations that people look at and confuse for reality, and there's bias, and of course a huge thing to do with ethics as well. And here are just some newspaper article titles about fears that people have about fairness and ethics and bias and so on in AI. So why do I put this all up? Really just to say, whoa, there is so much going on in this field, right? And so much needs to be studied. So there's a bit of a deja vu right now, in data science, a lot of companies are outsourcing, many are getting burnt, many are building in-house capacity. Sounds familiar. That's what we had 25 years ago with computational mathematics. So the data science community can do what we did at that time in applied math and computational mathematics and really push for these same things. And there are now people really trying to push for this. So it's been interesting to see this pattern repeat. Now, there are other things that I'm sort of talking about what was interesting over the last 40 years. And so I've talked about changes in hardware and software, computer languages, from data supported to data inspired to data driven, all very interesting. And one of the other things that I thought was super interesting, but also very frustrating in the last 40 years is the question of women and minorities in this sort of field. Data science, computational science is all sort of the same. So this was me in '84, where there were very, very few women in tech, about 15%. Many activities for affirmative action, girls in STEM, you name it. This was started in the 70s and in the 80s, lots of affirmative action.
That was in '84. I'm like looking, trying to.
No, that was not me in '84.
Like, wow, you really were. You know, just 10 years later, you were a Stanford professor. That's pretty good.
No, I was 19 then, but I felt this young right now. But I thought when I looked at the pipeline and I looked at all these incentive programs for particularly women in STEM at the time, that by the time I would be old, which I now am, according to my 18-year-old self, I'm ancient, everything would be solved, right? And we'd be in a different space. And what has been one of the other big surprises, which is why I had that broken wooden shoe at the first page of the talk, because there's an expression in Dutch, now breekt mijn klomp, which means what the heck happened, exactly. So this is the other thing, that breekt mijn klomp. So, because here I am in 2021, and guess what? The percentage of women is the same. So 40 years later, nothing's really changed in that. Now, I've always worried about this and thought about it, and particularly now when there's data-driven decision-making and you're missing out on a representation of half of your population. And I haven't even talked about underrepresented minorities who are really missing from this table as well. So allow me just focus on women right now, but this is a much bigger problem than just women. It's also the West versus the rest of the world. Is unrepresented minorities for sure. We need to think about data sovereignty and all these sort of questions. But now let's just think about women for a moment. So the percentages have not changed much, as I said. So if you look at engineering and computational sciences, or the college engineering, it's really very low. If we had put the numbers of the 80s there, it would actually have been a little bit higher than now. So from the 80s, it went down, and it's coming up very, very slowly, but not very fast at all. So it's very concerning to me, especially because after teaching for so long, I see constantly still, even though these myths have been debunked so many times, 2 myths that are really contributing to this. And it's extremely frustrating because we know they're not true. So here are the myths. One myth is that success in areas like that requires, so it's an if and only if proposition that I'm talking about here. Strong innate abilities. Okay, so in other words, people say you must have a natural genius or a natural ability in it, otherwise you cannot succeed. Now, strong innate ability helps, of course, right, with everything. Even if you want to run a mile fast, it's nice to be a natural athlete. But nobody's going to say you can never run a mile because you just have to train, right? So it's nice, but it is not a requirement, and yet a lot of people think it is. So this is also a difference between a fixed mindset. You only look at your innate ability that you have when you say you're born or when you're young, versus a growth mindset where you believe that you can grow and that you can learn, right? So this is very strong in here, and this is related to this imposter phenomenon as well. So that's one myth, and you see this myth in math, CS, and engineering, but you also see it in the financial sector, by the way, and you see it, maybe surprisingly so, in areas like philosophy. You see it in philosophy.
Oh, wow.
You see it in some areas of medicine, not all, but some areas where you see very, very few women. Typically, in areas where you see very few women, those are areas where they believe this, because it usually comes with this. Now, those areas where they believe you need these really strong innate abilities often also have this other myth where say girls or women do not simply have as much innate ability as the boys or the men. This is what I heard when I was growing up. My mom used to say this. I was really good at math, and she said, "Oh, well, this is just exceptional." So why is this exceptional? I said, because you're a girl. And she was never good at math. She said, "I'm not any good at math. You must have this from your dad." I said, "No, it's just me, But I still hear this. And when my son went through elementary school, I would still hear this from teachers, right? So this is something that's ingrained in our culture, and it starts really early on. And it's related to this imposter phenomenon, because if you pick up some of this when you're a woman, say, or an underrepresented minority, and you then enter a field like this, of course you feel out of your depth. You feel you may not belong, and you get these sort of feelings that are associated with what we now call the imposter phenomenon. And when I look at research around this, and I did some myself at Stanford, the imposter phenomenon, by the way, is equally strong, almost equally strong in men as it is in women. It's not, but when they first started, when the first papers came out on this, it was thought to be a female problem, which just showed why it happened in the first place, right? So really interesting. So I don't know how much you recognize yourself in this, but when I ask Stanford students about this, and even Stanford faculty, 80-90% of them said, "Yeah, I recognize that. I've had those feelings before, right? That I may not belong. I'm afraid I don't have what it takes. My advisor will find out sooner or later. I'm not as smart as he or she or they think I am." Stuff like that. So it's really very widespread. All right, so that's related to that. Now, the thing is, when it comes to women, of course, there are great women everywhere. And in 2015, after working for many years on helping women and trying to debunk those myths, there was a conference on campus in data science with only male faculty presenting again, right? So many of them. And I ran into the organizer and I asked, why do you only have men? And he says, "Well, Margot, we asked you to present, but you couldn't make it." And I'm saying, "Well, what about all these other women I know?" And he said, "Well, we really tried to find women, but we just couldn't find any." And in the meantime, I knew all these women. They were doing phenomenal things. And here are just a couple of my sheroes, right? So women that we've since promoted and given platform. And you may have heard of Timnit. She was a PhD student at Stanford, and We had her speak and promoted her, and then of course she got into this tremendously difficult situation at Google recently. But you have Latanya Sweeney, and you have people in Europe. They're everywhere in India. I mean, they're great women. So we said, that's it, or I said that, and I was speaking to one of my staff members in the institute at the time, said, we're going to change this. We're going to have a conference where we're only going to have female speakers, technical speakers, and we're going to promote them, with the idea to normalize the presence of women in the field. Because as long as you're different and you're seen as different, you will have the sense you don't belong, and these myths can perpetuate. And we can change it by normalizing the presence. Of course, women teach, right? Look at your teachers here. Of course, women do fantastic research. Of course, women lead. It's all normalized, it's logical. And how to do that? By increasing the presence of women. And so we thought, we're starting a conference, not just here, but everywhere in the world, where women are being promoted like that. They're being showcased. We will be a technical conference mostly. So it's not a conference where women come together to complain on how hard it is to be in data science or computational sciences. It's about women showing their outstanding work. And then we'll have all these talks, we'll put them online, we'll do podcasts, we'll just make sure that when you search something online, you see a lot of women too, right? So that was what we ended up doing. So these were the goals of what we then ended up calling Women in Data Science: inspire, educate, and support. And everyone can come to those meetings. It just so happens that all the speakers are women. So when people ask us, but Margot, why only women? I say, well, we asked Joe, but he couldn't make it. and we really tried to find men, but we just couldn't find any, right? So anyway, it's been fun, and we're everywhere now, which has also been really fun. So in 2015, we just started with a conference at Stanford, and now we have 250 conferences around the world. With now 600, 700 ambassadors, and it's been wonderful. So we're many different places, and we get many stories, of course, of data science around. This is particularly data science, computational sciences around the world. So it's been phenomenal. By 150,000 women per year that come together in those conferences. So for the life of me, never knew this was going to happen. You know, we just started with one conference. We started live streaming it. We got people interested. They say, hey, can we have our own WIDs? And I said, sure. So we built an ambassador program, and we're still running all of this with just three women on the Stanford campus. So it's been a lot of fun. But lots of good stories come out of girls and young women feeling connected to this and feeling they have a sense of belonging, which has been really wonderful. So we have conferences, as I talked about. We have lots of talks online. We do podcasts. We have workshops, we have a global datathon, we have high school outreach. You know, we do a lot of different programming in this, reaching more and more people. So check it out. We're at widsconference.org. Would be wonderful to have you part of our community. So I'd like to just finish by a few thoughts for you students on some of the education and challenges that I see students struggle with. If that's interesting to you. Yeah. Shall I continue? You can also stop.
I'm interested.
Yeah, you're interested? Okay, just a few observations. So this is Stanford campus with student populations. One of my friends drew a couple of cartoons for me for this. It's kind of fun. My son was a big penguin lover, so that's why I have a lot of penguin cartoons. So one of the things that I've seen over the last decades, just a little quick aside, which has been fun, is I started teaching Blackboard, right, in the 80s and 70s. I was a middle school and elementary school teacher for a while before I went to university. And so it was all Blackboard, right? And I'm still doing Blackboard, but we've done everything in between. Right? These are just some of the trends that we've had: MOOCs, interactive learning, active
You might have
learning.
to explain what a Blackboard is, because I think everybody here thinks it might be the interactive learning management system.
Oh, no,
It's the name of a
Blackboard with white chalk, you know, to draw, right? In fact, for a long time, I refused to use whiteboards because the smells made me a little giddy. I don't know, you know, the pens. But anyway, so there's been a tremendous amount of action in the last 40 years in this sort of search for optimal teaching, and happy to talk about that with people who find that interest. But I'm a Blackboard girl, and I've got good reasons for that, I think. One of the other things that we've seen at universities is that there is an increased reliance on metrics. So I don't know if you know this, but the teaching evaluations you fill out are really very important in promotion of people on campuses and decision making on campuses. We see metrics come up also in general job performance of your instructors and your professors, citation indices. Never thought I'd see that because they're really very rough and awkward quality measures that really, I don't think should be used at all. And there's much in terms of compliance issues. I mean, the university has changed a lot, right, over time. So that's one thing, certainly. But the other thing that I've really seen over the last years, and certainly in the last 20 years, is an increasing stress among students. And I want to just think a little bit about where that may come from. One of the very things that I see a lot on campus, and I really don't know if you have some affinity with this or you recognize this yourself. But I've noticed over the 30 years or so I've been teaching students at university that students find it increasingly hard to deal with ambiguity and uncertainty. And partly that's because of the way we teach them in high school and because of the way we teach them in undergraduate. So when you now go to high school and also elementary school, when I was teaching elementary school, we did a lot of ambiguity. We would have experiments that would sometimes fail, sometimes work, sometimes not. When I now look at the program of study in elementary school, middle school, and high school, and I'm very interested in this, a lot of this ambiguity is taken out. So you get the feeling as a student going through these schools that there is such a thing as the right approach, the only answer, right? That things are certain, that things always work a certain way. When my son went through this system, he would come home so often with homeworks where he was discounted for a totally valid approach. And when I would then talk to the teacher, because it was a very annoying mother, the teacher would say, no, that's not the correct approach. I said, what are you talking about? There's about 10 different ways you can solve this problem. But then the students come into university, and now they're doing research, and they're dealing with uncertainty. And all of a sudden they realize there is no one approach, right? There is ambiguity, there is uncertainty. You can go 5 different ways and it seems all very confusing. And a lot of the students that come to us, they have to unlearn a lot of the things they've learned. There's no such thing as a linear progression. When you go from A and you want to get to B, there's no such thing as a sequence of nice little steps. Usually it's very messy, right? This whole research process. So I see imposter phenomenon rife. The percentages have increased a lot as a result of this, I think also, and other things, other pressures. A lot of students expect judgment when they come in. One big difference I find in the last 30 years or so at Stanford is that when we were grad students, we would come in saying, we're learning, and the faculty are here to help us learn. And it was a very positive experience, I think, for most of us. Where you felt, I can ask questions and so on. Now the students are so scared to ask questions because they feel they're being judged. When they're asking questions, they're always judged. You're always tested, which of course is not the case. At university, you're there to learn. We're there to help you learn. So I think the joy in learning has been reduced and there is a big fear of failure. Anyway, that's been my experience. So I sometimes feel that students feel like this, right? So here we all are, faculty sitting on the throne judging you. But we're really like this, right? So we want you to jump in, deep water and opportunity and so on. That can be a little bit scary, but we're there to support you. Sometimes we jump in with you as well. So there is a disconnect there, and it's been interesting for me to see that. So here's some thoughts. So first of all is when you really think about it, if you want to be an expert in something, definition I really like of an expert is someone who's made every possible mistake, right? So not somebody who's a natural genius, right? So the beautiful thing about learning really is that there are always increasingly more questions than answers. One of the most common things I hear from PhD students on campus and elsewhere in the world, when they're thinking about their work, they say, I'm never done. I haven't found the answer to the questions. And no, of course not, because research is really good when it brings up more and more and more questions. right? So you should always, I think, in research, end up with more questions than answers. But it can feel very nerve-wracking because it feels like it's never ending. And the thing is, no, it's not. That's why it's research, right? You always get deeper and deeper. So why do you do research? Let's focus on that a little bit. No, because you love discovering, you love learning, you want to contribute, you want to collaborate, right? That's why you do research. Not because you like being judged or you want your diploma. This is why you do it, right? This is why you stay. This is why you stay in college. This is why you take courses. This is why you do projects. And what is research really? So if you look at the official definition, right, you say, okay, it's work that you undertake to increase the stock of knowledge. This is how I define research. You know, you make plenty of mistakes, you go off on many tangents in a delicious pursuit to create deeper insights, new concepts, and or improved methodologies. But the focus is really on the mistakes and going off on tangents, and you're sort of like a detective trying to suss things out. So like I said, students have to unlearn a lot of things, right? Because this is a new way of looking at it that does not come at high school very often. And you have to become comfortable with the uncomfortable, right? I always say. And here is something that a lot of people are not aware of that makes them feel a little bit stressed. And this is particularly, I think, it's much worse now with the computers right there and the internet right there than in the past. So as you go through university, this is a timeline of something you experience. So there's stuff you know, right? There's things you learn over time. And it's lovely because it goes up, right? So you learn, and that feels really good. But as you're going through this process, you also have another graph, and it tends to go like this. And that is the stuff you know you don't know. And that is because of Wikipedia, because every bit of knowledge is on your fingertips, because the discoveries are going so fast and furious. And over time, as you get older, the discrepancy between the stuff you know, which is your self-confidence, and you say, okay, I know some stuff, I can contribute. And the stuff you don't know, that difference gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And for a lot of students, as they go through a PhD, this is really disconcerting and very nerve-wracking because they feel they don't know enough at all. And they feel more and more and more overwhelmed. Now, when I was a student, this graph wasn't that steep because we did not have all this knowledge at our fingertips. I was not aware of so many things that were out there. So I wasn't aware of as much of the stuff that I did not know. Anyway, so this is one thing that a lot of people, that I hear a lot. Now, the last thing I just wanted to mention also is that what I see a lot with students, and that was different, I think 30 years ago, is that a lot of people are looking at optimization of trajectories, optimization of courses, optimization of next steps in their careers. And they think that if you're here now and that you want to end up there, there's this smooth linear path. If you only knew where it was. So I get questions like, which course should I take? Should I take this one or that one? Should I take this internship or that internship? Would this school be better than that school? I mean, they're constantly trying to optimize. But, in reality, things are more like this, right? So, and it's much more fun. So there's no straight linear path. And, actually, in my life, I've seen a lot of things like this, that you go through there and you end up actually there, and it's just as fun. Right. Another thing that I see a lot is you go like this, right? So you'll never actually get to where you wanted to get. So I spend.
There's no dot at all.
There's no dot. No.
That would be.
It disappeared. Yeah. So I reflect back on my own life and think, well, how the heck did I ever end up where I am doing the things that I've done? And I certainly, when I was a young girl, never thought I would come here. When I was a student at Delft, never thought I would do anything like this. The only thing I've ever done is jump on opportunities. And I've never been too scared to do something new. So that's the only thing I give myself credit for. But I know enough now to know that there is no such thing as the optimal choice, right? And that you can never look back and say things like, if I'd only done this differently, then now I would be there. You can't say that because life is very nonlinear. You can never say, if I'd only done this, then now it would have been better, or I would have had more opportunities, because you never know. The opportunities are created by the people you meet, and this is mostly random processes in life. And so I never planned my career. And I'm amazed to see where I ended up. And I've been very lucky in that way also. But I see a lot of people fretting so much about the optimal solution. And there's so many things online also where people claim that there is an optimal process to go through. And a lot of them actually make money out of that too, because they're advisors, for example, they're trying to get you into the best schools. Highly, highly overrated, by the way. Let me tell you, Stanford is highly overrated. That it's not worth that reputation. It has really absolutely certain. I work there, right? And so that alone already says enough. So that's good to keep in mind. That with all this uncertainty, non-linearity, you can never predict where you're going to be. So we are in an unbelievably rapidly changing world, right? That's one of the things I wanted to bring forward. What does it really mean when you think about it? This is what I think it means. It means that you need to have a zest for continued learning, right? You constantly need to, let's learn something new. This is super exciting. You need to be a little agile because things change so fast. Now, how do you get agility? By having low risk aversion, so not being afraid to jump into something new. And say, I will be fine. I will jump in and I will be able to swim because I can learn, right? You believe in your growth potential. And agility also comes through foundations, which is one of the things I always tell students. Hey, it's so good to know a bit of this foundational math and computing and statistics, because you can apply it in so many different ways. And once you have the foundations, it's easy to get the specialization, I think. And then these are things that I think are increasingly important in the world that we live in, right? Collaboration, asking questions, making mistakes, right? With this low risk aversion, handling some complexity, and also really being aware of some ethical judgment and integrity, because a lot of the things that you're doing in this world nowadays has consequences for others through the codes you develop. But my goodness, I often feel now, whoa, slow down, because things are going so fast, right? And when I was growing up in this, the pace was, I think, a lot slower. So I don't envy you for that. Now, the other thing I just wanted to tell you also, that, when you are in a situation like this, right, where all this thing comes at you and you're feeling that you're overwhelmed, you're feeling that things are moving so fast and you can't keep up. Sometimes you're struggling with the sense, I don't have a good enough innate ability, I may not belong. And then you have a year like we had last year, where you miss connections because you don't have others around you that can help put things in perspective. That's really tough. So I just want to acknowledge it's been a very tough year and a half. So important to have others around you to help say, hey, you're okay. Anyway, this is my email. So if you have any questions and want to connect with me, please do not hesitate to send me an email. If you're ever in Bend, do not hesitate to knock on the door and come stay with us. I'm always happy to chat about anything related to anything here. All right, so I know that was a lot. It's like a big brain dump, right? But I hope there were some things in that you found interesting or useful.